Okay, class. Okay, settle down. Today, we're going to be watching a Making Government Work. That's MGW for short.
Yeah, and it stands for, my gosh, why?
Great, I'm going to sleep.
You never know, it may be good.
Well, yeah, but it may be just a bunch of talking.
All right, pay attention. Now, you'll recall the last thing we discussed yesterday was the vocabulary for this lesson, Minorities and the Constitution. Sally, what is affirmative action?
I don't know.
The taking of positive steps to hire or admit persons from groups previously discriminated against in education and employment situations.
Fine. Any other questions about the vocabulary? Good. Earl, what amendments were passed after the Civil War?
Well, let's see.
One outlawed slavery. Another guaranteed equal protection under the laws.
You want the numbers?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know them. Just kidding. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection, and the 15th...
Very good.
Welcome to Making Government Work. Today we are going to discuss minorities and the Constitution. With me are Dr. Frances Wright, Professor of Women's Studies at the University of South Carolina, and Benjamin Mathers, Professor of Law, also at the University of South Carolina. Today I think I can safely say that American citizens feel fully protected by our Constitution. But this has not always been the case, has it, Dr. Wright?
It was apparent quite early that free blacks, women, and others were not considered full citizens. From 1800 until 1820 in Washington, D.C., free blacks were forbidden from carrying the federal mail or from holding elective office. From 1819, when Maine joined the Union, until after the Civil War, every new state denied the right to vote to free blacks and women.
However, members of the black community took comfort in the honorable language of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Still, some insisted that these documents were of no comfort and would never extend full citizenship to free blacks and slaves. In some states, segments of free blacks refused to pay taxes, decrying no taxation without representation.
Didn't the Supreme Court decide the issue of black citizenship with the Dred Scott case?
Yes. Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in Minnesota and Illinois, where slavery was forbidden. Upon his return to Missouri, he and his owners believed he was free.
They say that since you've been to Illinois and Minnesota where slavery is banned, that you ain't a slave no more.
That's what they say.
Isn't it true?
I don't know anymore. You know, since I've lived for several years as a free man, it's kind of hard to adjust to losing my freedom.
Ain't you done already lost?
I done won and lost. I done won and lost again. See, I won in Missouri's lower court, and I was free. The Supreme Court of Missouri, they overturned the decision. Now they say I'm a slave again.
After Dred Scott lost in Missouri, his owner, Mrs. Sanford, moved to New York. And Mrs. Sanford didn't care anything about owning slaves, and neither did the two men she left him with, Henry and Taylor Blow. It was clear that if Dred Scott was thought a citizen of Missouri and Mrs. Sanford a citizen of New York, he could sue her in federal court for his freedom. Article 3, Section 2 of the United States Constitution gives the federal courts jurisdiction in disputes between citizens of different states.
Oh, I bet Mrs. Sanford is mad at you for suing her.
Oh, no. She's against slavery. She's going to New York, married an abolitionist, a fellow named Emerson. She only agreed to be sued because she thought she'd lose the case.
So what happened in the federal court?
By taking my case, we felt like the federal court was recognizing me as a citizen. But the jury decided in favor of Mrs. Sanford. So we took the case to the Supreme Court.
So is you free or is you a slave?
I don't know. But the Supreme Court says I am a slave.
No! I mean, he's not a slave. I mean, that's not fair.
Well, Earl, would you mind telling the class why you think it's not fair?
Dred Scott was a free man. And by saying he wasn't, I mean, that means any blacks that were freed in one state weren't really free. I mean, they could be brought back to a slave state.
Unfortunately, the court went further than that. The court said that our founding fathers did not think of black men as part of the sovereign people who formed our government. Any comments?
Well, wasn't that decision a real blow to the black cause, since the court said that any man of African descent couldn't be considered a citizen of the United States or the state of Missouri?
I think it's important to mention that the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment is the basis of this decision. The court ruled that black slaves were property, and that a man cannot be deprived of his property without due process of law. Any other observations?
Wasn't the Dred Scott decision one of the events that started the Civil War? And then after the war, didn't many of the leaders think it was necessary to add to the Constitution in order to protect the rights of black citizens?
Very good. Let's pick back up with the tape now. I think they're getting ready to start the part about women and the Constitution.
Women fought hard to be included under the amendments, especially the 15th Amendment, but they were not.
Not only that, but early decisions following the passage of these amendments did not apply them to the actions of state and local government. And this left the states free to discriminate against blacks. Many states made up a whole host of laws to restrict black rights.
Were there any early cases involving women?
Women wanted to vote, and in the early 1870s, Mrs. Virginia Manor came forward to demand the right.
Jim, you're my lawyer. What do you think my chances are of registering to vote?
I think the Supreme Court's going to say that voting qualifications are left up to the state. You know, Virginia, I only wish half the men I know who have the right to vote were as informed of the issues as you are. A lot of voting men can't make an informed decision.
What if I just march myself over to the voter registration office and sign up to vote?
They'll refuse to register you. But if they do that, you can sue the state of Missouri in federal court. Now, you probably won't win, but the case would draw a lot of attention to your suffragette cause.
Good morning, ma'am.
I'm Virginia Manor, and I would like to register to vote, please.
That's real funny, lady. But you and I both know that only men can vote. Heck, in some states, you have to be a member of the right church, or you have to own a certain amount of property before you can vote.
This is an outrage. I am president of the Women's Suffrage Association, and I say that the Missouri Constitution is in direct violation of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and denies me one of the privileges and immunities of U.S. citizenship. And I will take this to the Supreme Court.
And I am the voter registration clerk for this county, and I'm going to have you arrested unless you get out of here. Women voting.
The Supreme Court ruled that since states had long regulated voter qualification by requiring property ownership, mental competence, and so forth, that states were within their power to exclude women from voting.
Then the Supreme Court faced a young woman who wanted to practice law.
Right. Myra Bradwell was trained in the law and took and passed the Illinois bar exam. But do you think she ever represented a client in court?
Your Honor, my client...
Woman, are you crazy? Now, just what do you mean, my client? Women cannot practice law.
I have studied law, and I passed the Illinois bar exam.
Well, I'll still hold you in contempt. Bailiff.
Any reactions?
It's not fair.
Well, imagine if you had lived back then. Does anyone have any idea how the Supreme Court ruled in this case?
The court decided that Mrs. Bradwell should not be allowed to practice law, even though she was obviously qualified. They decided that the choice of occupation was not connected with the right to being a U.S. citizen.
Very good, Anne. 3 of the Supreme Court justices thought she should not practice law. They believed that the natural delicacy and timidity of women made them unfit for many occupations. And according to God's plan, they belonged at home making babies. And now let's rejoin the lesson.
In the meantime, especially with the end of Reconstruction, things were not going very well for extending the rights of black Americans.
No, and the Plessy versus Ferguson case really drove that point home.
I'd like a ticket. First class, please.
Some mistake. You're going to have to move back to the colored section.
There's no mistake. I bought a first-class ticket, and I'm staying right here.
Look, boy, save yourself a lot of trouble. Come on and go with us.
Absolutely not.
Mister, you're in violation of state law, and I'm going to have to put you under arrest right now. So why don't you just come with me?
I'm just as good as anybody. And I can sit where I want.
So the courts found that the Louisiana legislature was free to make reasonable regulations under that state's police powers, and in doing so could take into consideration the customs and traditions of the people and the preservation of peace and good order.
Plessy versus Ferguson was a culmination of a half-century of dashed hopes for minorities.
Any questions before the tape moves into 20th century progress?
If the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, where did the government get off by forcing blacks to sit someplace different than whites? I mean, it's just another form of slavery, if you ask me.
Well, they believed that as long as facilities were equal, that any feelings of inferiority or servitude were problems that blacks would just have to handle for themselves. And thus began the separate but equal doctrine.
The early 20th century brought slow progress toward equal rights for minorities. The progress hinged on gradually applying the first 10 amendments to the states through the 14th Amendment.
Well, that progress was strengthened by the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and later by the 26th Amendment, which outlawed the poll tax as a condition for voting. But case law continued to expand rights. The Kramer case. Lewis and Fern Kramer were upset that a black family bought a house in their neighborhood.
Hi, hon. How are you? Good.
How was your day at work?
Pretty good.
Did you hear what happened today?
Yes, I heard that a colored family, the Shelleys, bought a house in this neighborhood. What are we going to do?
Well, there's a restrictive covenant in the deed to that house that says the owners of the property must be white. The deed prohibits sale to coloreds.
Well, how did you know that?
I went to the courthouse and looked. It's in every deed to every house on this block.
Well, we'll have to go to court and ask for an injunction stopping the Shelley family from moving in. Otherwise, I think our property values will plummet.
If I was to move in your neighborhood, would you move out?
You've lived beside me for 5 years. Now be quiet.
If you'll just wait, we'll discuss this case as soon as he finishes making this comment.
This case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Shelleys claimed that if the state court enforced the restriction, that the action of the state court in enforcing an injunction would be state action depriving the Shelleys of the equal protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment.
How did the court respond?
Well, the court said that making them enforce the agreement that asked for only whites in the neighborhood was asking the government to violate the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause.
But the Kramers said if the situation was reversed, if a white family was denied ownership of property in a black neighborhood, the courts would uphold that decision too. So there was no denial of equal protection.
Very good. Now they're going to discuss school segregation.
As early as the 1870s, states began setting up separate schools for blacks. By the 1930s, segregation, bolstered by the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, was firmly entrenched. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, the courts refined and limited the separate but equal doctrine. But in 1954...
You're gonna study hard for Mom today, aren't you? Good girl. Here are your books. You good girl. Bye. Bye.
You know, each morning when Linda leaves here and has to go past the school just 2 blocks up the street, I just get furious.
Hey, don't get mad at me. I didn't pass the law that set up separate schools. Blame the state legislature.
I know, but didn't some court say something about if the facilities are not equal, then the separate schools are not equal?
Yeah, there was a Supreme Court ruling on that. But as far as I can see, they are equal. They spend close to the same amount on facilities and on salaries.
Well, I don't care. I'm going to try to enroll Linda in the white school. Now, she's just as good as anybody.
Mr. Brown attempted to enroll his daughter and was turned down. So he went to court. At the same time, challenges to the separate but equal doctrine outlined in Plessy versus Ferguson were being brought up in Kansas, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Delaware. All 5 cases ended up in the Supreme Court. What was the basis for the court's decision to outlaw segregating public schools?
Can anyone answer his question?
Because a good education was more important to being successful in 1954 than it was in the 1860s, the Supreme Court said that schools separated by the government weren't really equal.
Also, I think the court felt that the legal separation of blacks and whites was seen by both as a sign of black inferiority. Now, separate schools for blacks and whites existed throughout the United States and were even sanctioned by law in 17 states. In 1952, the Brown case and 4 other cases were brought before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard arguments by Thurgood Marshall, the famous lawyer for the NAACP, but they failed to reach any decision. They later called for re-arguments. But in mid-1953, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Fred M. Vinson, died and was replaced by Earl Warren, one of the most famous and most controversial of all Supreme Court justices.
The Brown case spelled the end to all forms of segregation by law. Eventually, the court would outlaw all forms of public, government-funded segregation, such as public beaches, bus systems, libraries, and parks. With the courts focusing on ending segregation, Congress turned its attention to passing legislation to protect minorities from discrimination in the private sector. Can you tell us what happened in that arena?
The Equal Pay Act of 1963 required equal pay for equal work.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 barred private individuals from discrimination in public accommodation. Now, Congress took its authority to pass the Civil Rights Act not from the 13th and 14th Amendments, but from its power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among these several states.
Thank you, Darlene. Now, I want to tell you girls what I want you to do if any coloreds come in here asking for service.
Well, what are we going to do, Ollie?
Lynette, how many times have I told you? You direct them over there to the takeout window. Now, the only kind of service we're going to provide around here for coloreds is takeout service.
What about this new civil rights law?
Now, I am going to go to court, and I'm going to fight this law. Now, nobody's going to tell me who I can serve in my place and who I can't serve.
Excuse me. I'd like a cheeseburger basket and a drink, please.
Get out of here, boy. We don't serve coloreds in here. Now, you go on over to the takeout window.
Give me my cheeseburger.
Earl, I've had just about enough out of you. You want to go to the office?
Oh, no, please, let me stay. This is great stuff. I'll never be refused a cheeseburger.
Okay, but just calm down.
In McLung versus Katzenbach, the Supreme Court did not agree with Mr. McLung, the owner of the restaurant. He believed that Ollie's out-of-the-way family barbecue business had no substantial connection with interstate commerce. Therefore, he was exempt from the law.
That's right. The court held that the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce is broad and sweeping, and the civil rights law is within its sphere. Congress and the courts continued to expand protections against discrimination for women and blacks during the 1960s.
However, companies and the governments faced a problem in the 1960s of having built up a long history of discriminatory practices. In order to effectively make up for the wrongs of the past, the court instructed companies, schools, and governments to affirmatively make up for what they had done to minorities. Now, this brought in some new twists and some new applications of the law. I hope you all remember the definition of affirmative action.
I want in that training program.
I'm sorry, Brian. Ordinarily, you'd be eligible. But you know we have to promote blacks in 50% of our skilled worker slots.
That's not fair.
Listen, the company and the union wanted to implement this policy because blacks have been discriminated against. Look at it like this. Blacks make up 40% of our workforce, yet they're only 20% of our skilled labor. Now, that isn't fair either, is it?
No, that isn't fair. But I didn't discriminate, and now I'm being punished for the wrongs older guys did in the past?
Brian Weber made it to the Supreme Court with his assertion that the affirmative action plan of the Kaiser Company and the union was a form of discrimination which violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
How did the Supreme Court handle this one?
Well, it said that just because the aim of the Civil Rights Act was to stop discrimination, well, that didn't mean that the act prevented unions or employers from giving more advantages to those who had been treated unfairly in the past.
Yes. The majority held that an employer and union may develop programs to eliminate the vestiges of past discrimination and segregation.
Affirmative action programs are the result of a series of executive orders calling for employers and universities to create more job opportunities for minorities and women. The idea was to prevent future discrimination against these groups and to help remedy the effects of past discrimination. Critics of affirmative action call it reverse discrimination.
After I was rejected for admission to medical school last year, I wrote a letter to the university stating that I believed I was denied admission to medical school because I'm white.
What is the affirmative action policy of UC Davis?
Well, 16 of the 100 openings for freshman medical students at Davis are reserved for minorities.
That means that when you apply, you're competing for one of 84 openings. But when members of a minority apply, they're competing for one of 100 slots.
That's right. And I scored in the top 10% on the medical school admissions test, significantly higher than most of the affirmative action admittees.
Frankly, Alan, I don't think we're going to overturn affirmative action programs.
I don't want to overturn affirmative action programs. I just don't want to be discriminated against. And more than that, I just want to be a doctor. Me, one individual.
We can mount a strong challenge against this type of affirmative action program because it is based on a quota system.
When Alan Bakke faced the Supreme Court, the justices had to determine whether the affirmative action program at UC at Davis was violative of the Constitution's 14th Amendment and the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
How did the court rule?
The court did not completely eliminate affirmative action programs, but the court did order Alan Bakke's admission into the university, stating, "The guarantee of equal protection does not mean one thing when applied to one person and something else when applied to a person of a different color."
But the divided court indicated that race could be considered a plus, even though rigid quotas are violative of the Constitution.
We've tried to trace for you the highlights of the U.S. Supreme Court's application of the Constitution to minorities over the years. There are thousands of cases which we have not mentioned. Your teacher will further explain the reasoning of the court in the cases we have covered.
There are limits to what even the most ingeniously designed and energetically executed laws can achieve. An analysis of the changing status of blacks and other minorities over the past few decades shows a long period of overt and systematic discrimination. The denial of civil rights is followed by the awakening of a strong sense of injury and by the arousal of determined effort. There then follows an active challenge to the status quo, and eventually an opportunity to exercise rights guaranteed in theory, but previously denied in practice.
Yeah, but once the laws have been changed and they're being enforced, people find that there's still something missing. That people don't change the way that they feel, and that a change in laws just isn't enough.
People who are being discriminated against must either realize that either more and better laws are necessary, or that laws alone won't make people act fairly.
At any rate, students, you'd better wake up, or you may one day find your rights just slipping away. We'll discuss this more tomorrow. I've invited in a lawyer to answer your questions. I'd like Cynthia, Sally, Jim, and Earl to stay after class, please.